No, we don't. We got to. All right.
Welcome, everyone. Glad you're joining us. We'll wait just a couple of minutes to begin. Make sure everybody gets seated, figuratively, that is, seated in the Zoom room.
Good evening, wonderful old friends. I see Jim and Carol is here again this evening. I really miss seeing you two. We may try to pull off some live events next year, and that'll be fun to see you. To see as many of you who also miss live events like we do. Larry, our old friend Larry, is with us. Many family members here this evening. Larry, do you know?
No, I don't think so tonight.
Larry has quite a crew, the Chimino crew. Loves to bring them. And
They have little kids now and they're occupied with various things, as happens.
well, good evening and welcome to the Indiana Council of World Affairs. We have another wonderful program planned for you this evening. Very excited. This is another program that's brought to you by Great Decisions. Now, for those of you who have been joining us this year, I'm very, very proud to say that our Great Decisions this year is being sponsored by the Central Indiana Community Foundation. We're very pleased to have their generous support, which allows us to bring great programs to you. And if you do not know, all the while that you've been with us, you are a part of America's longest running public discussion forum on global matters. This has been going on for decades. You know, the Indiana Council of World Affairs has been around for, I think, about 75 some years. But overall, the whole idea of the Foreign Policy Association, which is sort of the mentor for the Great Decisions program, and then also in association with the World Affairs Councils of America, which came some decades later. They have actually all been around since post-World War I. I've not sort of given this little quickie talk about this for a long time, but just as a reminder for those of you, you might remember that during World War I, we were an isolationist nation. People were still alive who remember the Civil War and what had nothing to do with it. No one was alive since the time of George Washington, who said, have nothing to do with European affairs. We're done with them. Let's just be on our own. But we were an isolationist country. And then after World War I, many people went back into that until World War II, which really thrust us onto a world stage. But the Foreign Policy Association had the wonderful insight to think, you know, we are part of the world stage. This war brought us into that. And the problem is that America has been isolated for so long and so detached from its neighbors, even from Canada and Mexico, our closest neighbors, that we don't really have a good understanding of foreign affairs and global matters. And particularly as they were intersecting with the United States. I guess in our thoughts of isolationism, we thought, well, we won't be bothering you, you won't be bothering us. We'll just simply do what we will, which is, of course, what we did with many parts of Latin America and the Philippines and Hawaii. Are sort of really busy with our manifest destiny in those regards. But we just really did not see our relationship, certainly with Europe and the rest of the world, a very large rest of the world, Africa, Asia. And the Foreign Policy Association wanted to bring these types of forums to people in a nonpartisan manner to start to begin in education. I would suspect that admittedly in the very beginning, it was probably more isolated to people who had higher levels of education and had the time and luxury to sit around and discuss these great affairs. What is wonderful about today is that because of the broad proliferation of news and newspapers, more people do know about world affairs. It's very difficult to work for a company anymore that does not have a global connection. And that includes Indiana. As Lee Hamilton once said a long time ago when he was first elected to Congress, someone said, well, Lee, what are you doing on the Foreign Affairs Committee? Shouldn't you be serving on the Agriculture Committee? And he said, well, for heaven's sakes, do you think we eat all those soybeans and corn? And trade was a major factor to our engagement internationally. And our programs now also include students, so our high school students, and we would love to include college students if we could, but particularly our high school students through Academic World Quest. So the spectrum has come very wide. We're no longer just a sort of a educationally elitist organization. We are a very broad spectrum, attracting a broad spectrum of people who have served overseas in various capacities, are now very curious about it. There's more traveling, and we are simply impacted by it. I think we're for companies. And so you are part of a very wonderful tradition of these discussions. And so when we were live, I used to talk about that a little bit about how we exist and what you're a part of. And I thought maybe it might be kind of nice to remind you this evening. And we have a reputation for doing outstanding speakers. We have several coming up that I want to tell you about before we get on with this evening's program. On April the 5th, I want to remind you that we've not been together for a long time, and there's an opportunity if you would like to do that. We've made the arrangement. Amy Stark, our communication coordinator, has made an arrangement for us at Beef and Boards. Many of you in Indianapolis may know Beef and Boards. This is I believe, a Wednesday evening, April the 5th, and it's a dinner theater event, and I believe it is $28, and that includes your dinner, your tax, your gratuity, and the show. The show will be at American in Paris. And there are songs that you're going to be familiar with. I've Got Rhythm, Shall We Dance? So you will go away, I think, with a wonderful dinner. It's a cash bar. You're going to want to dance. You're going to want to go out there and go dancing somewhere after music like that. But mostly, you are going to be with people you've not seen for a while. So we hope you join us. That is April the 5th. And then one of our board members, Orna Sultem, is organizing a panel discussion and media exhibit on the climate crisis on May the 4th at Heron School of Art, where she is a chair in international studies. So if you can go to that, that would be really wonderful. I believe that is free and open to the public, unless someone speaks out and says I'm wrong. So that's Orna Sultem, a panel discussion, media exhibit on the climate crisis. I'm just going to be really frank with you and tell you that we have found within our own programs, whether it's Great Decisions or Distinguished Speakers, when we've had a program on climate crisis, it's been one of our least attended. We've noticed that trend for several years. And it makes me feel kind of sad because it is considered one of the worst global crises that we have. It's considered one of the worst crises, period, that the whole world is experiencing. And it's going to impact, if we don't address this, it's going to impact a whole number of factors, including wars. People have predicted potential of wars based upon just the lack of water and migration, the global migration, the kind of friction caused by that. And so that's going to be a great opportunity to see that May 4th. That'll give you an opportunity, I think, to engage and ask some questions. For our own programs after this evening, Great Decisions next meets on April the 12th. And that will be the rise of left-wing governments in Latin America. And that will be with Dr. Michael Snodgrass, who's with IUPUI. On April the 18th, just 1 week later, we have a program on global famine. This will also be distinguished speakers. That will be with Dr. Sylvia Broder from Purdue University. And you know, Purdue University is the cradle of astronauts, but is also a school that has produced an awful lot of accolades in agriculture. And they have they're doing, in the words of Lee Hamilton, much more than just growing corn and soybeans. They are making profound steps and working closely in many innovative efforts of agriculture and addressing global famine. Some really exciting programs. I'd be very keen to hear about that. Our next Distinguished Speakers program is going to be April the 25th. In April, that particular program is going to be with the Irish consulate. speaking on the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. For those of you who followed that part of the world for quite a bit of time, you will know that that was the accord that brought together peace that many of us who watched the war between the Northern Ireland and the Republic, we didn't think it would end. It went on for a very long time. It included the loss of many, many lives. It was really a treacherous war, a bloody war. And the Good Friday Agreement was a tremendous step in bringing a sustainable peace to that region. So you don't want to miss that. And also, I'd like to remind you that if you have not gotten your briefing book for Great Decisions, they are still available. You may get them through our website. And for every topic we have in Great Decisions can be found in that briefing book. I want to tell you also that if you are interested in that beef and board occasion on April the 5th, which is just 1 week, I think, from this Wednesday, is that right? Yes, you can get your ticket by going through our website. So that excites me that you have to go through our website to get something. So I wanted to get, and I'm going to just be really honest with you. We usually save the announcements for the end because we don't want to take away the thunder from our speaker. But so many of you, as the Q&A goes on, you leave. We thought, well, we don't want you to leave before you hear these announcements. So we wanted to make sure we got those in. So that's what we wanted to do. Now, I also just want to say very quickly, I'm very pleased that you're joining us. We're getting close. You know, we're really actually getting close. This is now the end of March. So we just have April and maybe a little bit of May. We're getting very close to the end of our program season for both Great Decisions and Distinguished Speakers. We've had a really tremendous year, and it feels like a huge gallop because we have the two overlapping programs at once. And we have, the speakers are fantastic, and you've hung with us and you've attended and you have come. And if you have not yet become a member, please consider doing that. That does a number of things. That tells us that you support the programs. It allows us to grow. And I'll just be really honest with you. We need to seek funding. We would like to write some grants. We can do some really great ideas we have going out to allow us to grow. And if we can say that we have this level of membership, the numbers of the people who come are really great. But if we can say that we have this level of membership, it says that you support us. And we know you do because you keep coming week in and week out. So please do consider becoming a member. And at the very least, also, please consider becoming a donor. That means so much to us. Doing Zoom has significantly reduced our program costs. We're very fortunate for that, but it has not reduced all of our program costs. And we want to be able to keep bringing together high quality programs. One of the things we would like to do going forward is seeing how we might be able to do hybrid. And we've not done hybrid yet because it takes a bit of sophistication with technology, and we don't have funds for that. And we're not going to do anything clunky. We want to be able to keep this level of smooth preparation and presentation. We want to continue having the engagement that, for the people who attend by Zoom, you are as actively engaged as the people who might be in a live audience. And in no way we want to do anything that would take away from that. But that requires a level of technology that we just don't have. We're just not going to go out and buy a mic, and we want to do it right. So just some great ideas. And with that, I think I'm looking forward to tonight because we have one of our very own board members who brings profound experience, Kenneth Holland, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about this topic. And Robin, I would like to ask my fellow board member, Robin Cohn, if you would please introduce Dr. Holland.
Thank you, Betty, and thank everyone for attending tonight. I'm really excited to and very honored to introduce Dr. Kenneth Holland. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and master's degree in government from the University of Virginia. He is the president emeritus of the American University of Afghanistan and has held academic appointments at universities in India, Japan, Australia, Canada, and the US. He is the former president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the US, and he is a scholar of international relations with a focus on South Asia, and has published 8 books and more than 80 articles in peer-reviewed academic journals. with no further ado, Dr. Kenneth Holland, please, thank you for joining us tonight, and go take it away.
Thank you, Robin, for that kind introduction. So let me share my screen. So the topic tonight is one of the most important in understanding the current state of geopolitics. And it actually explains a lot of the conflicts that we're dealing with in the world today. And many of them, of course, affecting the United States. So first of all, we're talking about energy, and we need to be fully aware of just how important energy is to us and to the world. We use energy to heat and cool our homes, light our office buildings. We need energy to power our automobiles, to move freight, in manufacturing. We need energy in all aspects of our daily lives. And if we look at how we use energy here in America, 40% is used for residential and commercial purposes. Industry, manufacturing, consumes 32% of the energy produced. And then just moving people, cars and moving cargo, freight, consumes another 28% of the energy that we produce. So energy consumption is continuing to grow. It's expected to increase by about 7% a year for the next 20 years. If we look at how the average American uses energy, you can see that electricity accounts for more than half of our consumption. Heating water, air conditioning, heating your home, refrigeration, lighting appliances, all need electricity. If you fly, then you're also consuming airplane fuel. Of course, if you drive an automobile, you're also consuming gasoline. And then, of course, if you're heating your house with natural gas, you're consuming natural gas as well. So Americans depend on aspects of their daily life. Now, in the article by Carolyn Kissane in the Great Decisions briefing book, she points out that even though there's a lot of attention now on renewable sources of energy, 75% of all the energy consumed around the globe is from fossil fuels. So oil, natural gas, and coal still power 3/4 of the world. Only if you look at the United States, 79% of the energy consumed in this country comes from hydrocarbons. Only 8% is from nuclear power plants, and only 13% is from renewable sources of energy. And global consumption of energy is expected to rise by 40% over the next 2 decades. So the world is continuing to consume more and more energy, and 3/4 of it comes from fossil fuels. In the year 2022, obviously, where we were bouncing back from the slowdown caused by the pandemic, and in 2022, the world emitted more carbon dioxide than in any other year on record. Emissions grew by almost 1% in 2022. Carbon dioxide emissions from coal grew 1.6%. Emissions from burning oil grew 2.5%. So more and more carbon dioxide is being released into the atmosphere each year. And because the Chinese economy is now roaring back from the pandemic, we expect 2023 to set another record for emission of carbon dioxide. And of course, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is one of the major causes of global warming. If you look at who has oil around the world, you'll notice that it's not evenly distributed. So as you can see, two countries have the largest reserves of petroleum, Venezuela in South America and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Other countries that have large reserves of petroleum are Canada, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and one has to ask oneself, okay, who are the reliable partners for the United States? So obviously Canada is a friendly country, but when you look around the world, Iraq is a friendly country right now, but we have very, very difficult relations with Venezuela, with Iran, obviously with Russia, and our relationship with Saudi Arabia is deteriorating. So Saudi Arabia is moving away from the American camp and more toward the Russian, Chinese, Iranian alignment. Fortunately for us, since 2005, with the introduction of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, the United States has greatly increased its production of oil and natural gas, and we have become self-sufficient. We're one of the few countries in the world that produces all the energy that it needs to consume. In fact, the United States is now a net exporter of energy. In 2022, the US exported 30% of its crude oil production and more than 15% of its natural gas. The Biden administration has approved the construction of new liquefied natural gas export terminals. There'll be several more operating by the end of 2025, and the 3 more under construction. So the United States has decided to benefit from the demand for oil and for liquefied natural gas. Here's a photograph of one of our newest LNG terminals in Hackberry, Louisiana, opened in 2019. And I said 3 more of these are now under construction. You can see in this graph how for many years, the production in the United States of petroleum products lagged far behind our consumption. But look what happened in the year 2020. So for the first time, the amount of petroleum produced in the United States actually exceeded the amount that we consume. So for the last 3 years, we've been producing a surplus of petroleum in the United States. If you look at oil consumption, you can see that the United States, the dark blue, is a major consumer of oil. The other top consumer, of course, is China. So the world's 2 largest economies are also the 2 largest consumers of petroleum. Other large consumers are, of course, Japan, South Korea, India, Brazil are also major consumers of petroleum as well. Here you have a couple of pie charts, and these pie charts graphically make the point that the United States produces 20% of the oil in the world, and the United States consumes 20% of the oil in the world. So there's a perfect balance there. Saudi Arabia produces 12% of the world's oil, Russia 11%, Canada 6%, China 5%. Now, what you should pay attention to in these 2 pie charts is where there's a mismatch. And you can see with China, China consumes 14% of the oil produced in the world, but it only produces 5%. So China is dependent on imports of oil. India, again, India consumes 5% of the oil produced in the world, but India produces very, very little oil. So India is another country that's dependent on imports of oil. Japan also, South Korea, and Germany. All those countries are dependent on import of petroleum products. They have what we call energy insecurity. Again, this is just a list of how many barrels are produced each day. And you can see that the United States produces almost 19 million barrels of oil per day, far more than any other country. This graph shows you how the United States was producing less oil than its competitors, primarily Saudi Arabia, Russia. But you can see what happened beginning. So 2005 is when the fracking revolution began. And you can see that by 2008, oil production in the United States started to rise dramatically and surpass all other countries in 2016. So this is quite a story of how the United States has become the world's largest producer of oil in just a few years, since 2005. So this is called the shale revolution because this fracturing takes place within a shale where the oil and gas are trapped. And so the United States is now the global leader in the production of crude oil and gasoline and diesel fuel as well. Here's a illustration, an image showing you how fracking actually works. You can see that there are three major components: water, chemicals, and sand. And they are pumped down into this, to a well, and into pipes into the ground and into the layer where the gas and oil is. The water, sand, and chemicals injected into the well cause fractures in the rock. And when the fractures open up, that releases the trapped oil and gas inside the rock, and then it's pumped out and stored. So that's fracking. Now, as you can see, not every state, including Indiana, produces oil and natural gas through hydraulic fracturing. The leading states, as you can tell, Texas is at the top with almost 15,000 fracking wells. Oklahoma is another state. Colorado, another big producer. Pennsylvania, more than 2,000 wells. I've been to North Dakota. I was a guest of the University of North Dakota a few years ago, and it was the wealthiest university I've ever visited. They had a hockey arena that looked like it was built for the NHL. So wonderful facilities at the University of North Dakota. They're just swimming in money from the production of oil. So, but you can see that Indiana, Illinois, the Midwestern states are not producing oil. New York, New England, they're not producing oil. So you can see where it's concentrated, where the oil and natural gas basins are located. Now, on the other side is the fact that the consumption of energy is not even around the world. So about 3.5 billion people lack reliable power. And so this has led the United Nations to establish a sustainable development goal, which says that by the year 2030, all people living in the world will have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. And the major index that the United Nations uses is the access to household electricity. And if you take access to household electricity as your measure, then 45% of the world lives without reliable power. as you know, I travel extensively around the world, primarily in developing countries, and I've been the victim many, many times of extensive blackouts, and in two countries in particular, South Africa and Pakistan. So I was talking to a business person in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and he said, you know, we're going to close our factory here because it's so expensive for us. When the power goes out, our manufacturing line shuts down. We have to wait hours for it to come back on, and it's just not profitable for us to work in such an environment. So the lack of reliable electricity is really hurting the economic development of countries like South Africa and Pakistan. So here's a nice map showing you which parts of the world have reliable power. Obviously, we're in that gray zone, fortunately for us, but you can see many countries do not have reliable power. So Brazil, Argentina, much of South America lacks reliable energy. Most of Africa, including South Africa, Asia, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, Turkey, they all lack reliable power. So the countries that are most vulnerable to interference in the international oil market are the ones I mentioned earlier. These are countries that do not produce much oil of their own, so they're dependent on the international market to acquire their energy supplies. So Pakistan, India, South Africa, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, they are in a very vulnerable position if there are any disruptions to the global energy market. Now, we always like to imagine what would the world be like if there were free trade. I'm a big advocate of free trade myself, and I always sort of posit, you know, a what if when I'm thinking about commodities that are traded around the world. So if there were, in fact, no disruptions in the trade of petroleum products and natural gas, then obviously there would be no cartels such as OPEC. The European Union would not be placing limits on the import of Russian oil and natural gas. Consumers would pay less. If there's a free market, customers would buy the gas and oil at the lowest price. So consumers would pay less for gasoline, heating oil, natural gas, electricity, and fewer countries would be energy insecure. So that's if there were a free market with no disruptions. But as we know, there are disruptions, and fossil fuels are in fact a major source of global conflicts. Fossil fuels are in scarcity and they're not evenly distributed, as we saw earlier. So some of the conflicts that can be traced to this competition over access to hydrocarbons are conflicts in Iraq, Syria, South Sudan, Crimea, Ukraine, South China Sea. In each of these regions of the world, there's a contest for control of oil and gas assets. So countries believe that control over oil and gas reserves is an essential component of national power. It's some ways similar to nuclear power. And many countries want to be have nuclear weapons because they believe that will give them more security and more influence in the world. And at the same time, countries want to have control over oil and gas as well. So the Islamic State, as we know, launched an effort to conquer both Iraq and Syria back in 2013. They were trying to seize oil fields in Iraq and Syria. You can look at Putin's seizure of Crimea in 2014 as an effort to gain control over the Black Sea, which is rich in oil and natural gas. South Sudan seceded from Sudan in order to gain control over the oil reserves in the south of Sudan. And China has become extremely aggressive in the South China Sea, and there have been many conflicts between China and the Philippines, as well as other countries that border on the South China Sea, because China wants to control the oil and natural gas resources that lie underneath the South China Sea. So many of the conflicts fueling violent conflict, violent in the world today, are due to this competition to control hydrocarbons. So many people will respond immediately to this analysis and say, well, countries can become energy self-sufficient, countries can reduce their dependence on other countries that use oil and gas as a lever, as a weapon, by replacing dependence on fossil fuels with renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar power. And there's a big movement in this way. In Europe, electricity generation from wind and solar power exceeded that of gas or nuclear power for the first time in 2022. So Europe is furthest along in this shift from fossil fuels to renewables to clean energy. Here are the 5 major sources of renewable energy, or types: wind, solar, biomass, hydro, and geothermal. And what's interesting in this particular image is you see what percentage of global electricity generation comes from that particular type of renewable energy. So wind, 6.6%, solar, 3.7%, biomass, 2.3%, hydro, 15.3%, and geothermal, less than 1%. So the largest single type of renewable energy that is consumed today, of course, is hydroelectric power. Also, you'll see the cost of producing this type of renewable energy, and it's expressed in dollars cost per megawatt hour, 1,000 kilowatts of electricity generation per hour. And you can see that the cheapest renewable energy is solar energy, $36 per megawatt hour. And then the next cheapest is very close, is wind power at $38 per megawatt hour. Obviously, biomass is the most expensive, followed by geothermal and then hydro. So wind and solar seem to be the 2 most attractive forms of renewable energy. This is a familiar sight for any of those of you who drive to Chicago from Indianapolis. You'll see, so actually Indiana has the 4th largest wind turbine farm in America. And they're along Interstate 65 between Indianapolis and Chicago. Germany is an energy importer, as we saw, and Germany is trying to make this transition to renewables. So in 2021, renewables produced 46% of German power consumption. In 2022, up from 41% in 2021. And as we know, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany tried to distance itself from dependence on Russian energy and decommissioned the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline from Russia, announced that it was going to build a liquefied natural gas terminal, and that will allow Germany to import LNG from the United States. Now, there's a risk, however, in making that transition from dependence on hydrocarbons to clean energy. The risk is that many of these renewables rely on technology that is dominated by China, which of course is a geopolitical rival to the United States and to the European Union. So China dominates the market, for example, in electric vehicle batteries. Chinese-owned companies control lithium mines around the world. China has a stranglehold on the world's cobalt reserves that principally lie in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the move from gasoline-powered automobiles to electric vehicles actually makes us more dependent on China. China dominates the production of wind turbines. It also dominates the manufacture of solar cells and lithium-ion batteries. China dominates the supply of the raw materials needed in the renewable energy sector. 70% of rare earths used in renewable energy technology are mined in China. 90% are processed in China. When America needs rare earths such as neodymium for wind turbines, it comes from China. If it needs minerals to make solar panels such as tellurium, indium, or gallium, they all come from China. If you look at this chart, it's really quite striking how much China dominates the rare earth sector. In terms of mine production, it's just 140,000 versus the next highest, which is the United States at 38,000. Look at the reserves. China has much larger reserves of rare earth minerals than does any other country. China has 38% of the total reserves of rare earth minerals. And in terms of disruption, we don't have a free market. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries sets the price of oil, sets production by limiting production. It can raise the world price. It was used to punish countries that supported Israel in its wars with Israel. So OPEC today has 15 member countries accounting for 44% of global oil production and almost 82% of the world's oil reserves. So OPEC is a major player in the geopolitics of energy. Those of us who are old enough to remember, there was this huge oil shock in 1974 as a result of the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The price of oil rose by nearly 300%. There was another oil shock in 1979 in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. So the Middle East is a powder keg, and the politics of the Middle East have a lot to do with the cost of energy on the global market. If you want to understand why India has refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all you have to do is understand India's dependence on the import of fossil fuels to produce energy. And India has taken advantage of the sanctions imposed by the West on Russia to buy even more oil from Russia. So India is practicing free market principles, buying oil from the producer at the lowest cost. So the United States would benefit from a free market in energy since we're a net exporter. Europe obviously would benefit because prices would be lower, but we don't have a free market, as we know. Lots of interference, lots of disruptions, and we also see that the movement toward renewables is desirable from many points of view, including prevention of global warming, but it's also increasing European and American dependence on China. So thank you for your attention, and I'm really interested in hearing your comments and answering your questions. Robin?
Actually, Ken, I'm going to take over and
Oh.
do the questioning here. You want to end your slideshow?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. As usual, those of you who are familiar with our routine here, if you have a question, you can address it to me, and and if you want to ask your question in person, I'll call on you, but I'd like to do it in the order people submit them. So if you would just go to the chat room and send your questions to me, Ray Montagno, I will call on you in the order in which the questions arrive. So if you would like to do that, that'd be great. So while we're kind of waiting for that, I do have kind of a question for you, Ken, with respect to these rare earth elements. Maybe a comment first and then a question. First, the term rare earth is kind of a misnomer. They're not actually that rare. They happen to occur in conjunction with other kinds of mineral deposits. But the idea when you had the reserves up there, those are proven reserves, right? I mean, in fact, in the United States, because of strict regulation and NIMBYism, we haven't done much exploration for rare earth elements in the United States. So I guess my question is there something, the United States should be doing, that we could be doing to kind of increase our supply of rare earth elements domestically?
Yes, so there has been some discussion in the Biden administration about really ramping up the exploration for rare earth minerals. But as you say, there's a lot of not in my backyard resistance to that because even to be very large mines, many strip mines probably as well. So yes, the Biden administration is very much aware that we haven't really determined what the reserves of rare earths are in the United States. Also, in terms of foreign policy, as you saw, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a major source, for example, of cobalt. So Africa as a continent has huge potential to supply rare earths. So again, the Biden administration, as you saw, Vice President Kamala Harris visited Africa. First Lady Jill Biden visited Africa recently. So there's a need to really have good relations with those countries in Africa that also have reserves.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question here. The European nations are kind of being forced to face the results of their energy reliance on Russia. Is the sentiment across Europe kind of the same about the desire to decouple from Russia? There's some countries, maybe Hungary, for example, that would just as soon maintain their dependence on Russia.
Yes, that's a very fascinating set of relationships, Ray. If you look at the countries that belong to the European Union, some of them are very sympathetic toward Russia. Hungary is definitely one of them. But what the European Union does, it uses its economic clout over countries like Hungary to bring them into line. So when Hungary says, "Oh, we're going to continue to buy, oil and natural gas from Russia," then what the European Union does is says, "Okay, if you want to, ignore the EU foreign policy on this issue, then we're not going to give you the transfer payments." Because in the European Union, the poorer countries receive large transfer payments from the richer countries. So that kind of politics of money has really enabled Brussels to maintain control over some of the outlying countries.
Okay, thank you. I think Mel Miller has a question. You there, Mel?
No, I have a question though. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
here comes Mel.
This is just a basic question. Since the U.S. is now a net exporter of oil by a significant amount, more than we use, why is the price of oil always set by OPEC?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So basically, oil is a global commodity. It's an international commodity. So the oil that we produce simply becomes part of that international flow. So let's say you are a refiner. It's quite interesting, Mel, because let's say you own a refinery in Louisiana. You might actually prefer, for economic reasons, to buy oil from Saudi Arabia when you could get it from Texas, your next door country. So the market itself determines, what is most cost effective for each refinery. And remember, all these oil companies are multinationals. They have oil wells and oil rigs all over the world. So really, whatever we produce here becomes part of that international pool of oil.
Okay, thank you. Pierre, do you have comments you'd like to make?
You think if you put yourself, picture yourself somehow, that should be.
Pierre, you out there? Maybe not. And Nils, you just muted yourself.
Sorry about that. I was struggling.
Okay,
to
go
unmute
ahead,
myself.
Pierre.
I
Sure.
apologize.
No problem.
Hang on a second here. Let me, yeah, okay. Hi. Really enjoyable. I learned a lot. It was very, very interesting talk. I guess you sort of raise a really interesting conundrum, and that is that for many reasons, obviously climate change being a major one, which a lot of people would argue is an existential threat. It's in the interest of both the United States and Europe and other countries to move away from fossil fuels more towards renewables. And you do point out that right now China has sort of perhaps maybe not cornered the market, but has a tremendous amount of influence in these rare earth minerals and the technology for renewables. As the U.S. moves away from this, and China is already increasing its influence in the Middle East, including with Saudi Arabia, which China, as you know, when China deals with other countries, they do not put any preconditions like democracy or human rights or anything else. So a lot of non-democratic countries really like dealing with China, including American ostensible allies that are not democratic. As this happens, if we move in the direction of more renewables, and China's influence may increase. On the other hand, you can make the argument that we need to move in this direction of renewables for the climate and for the earth. I guess my question is sort of like, how do you think we can square this circle, and to what extent might that be possible? And I just want to, and before you answer that, one quick factual thing. Just a couple of days ago, when President Biden met with Prime Minister Trudeau, one of the agreements that they had discussed was the United States supporting much greater mining in Canada for rare earth minerals as a way where the U.S. would be the primary market, the purchaser of the minerals that would be mined in Canada. And obviously that's a way to sort of wean ourselves off of Chinese dependence. But the question, I guess, is how could we sort of square the circle of moving more towards renewables while China's influence is increasing as we do that? Can we do that? What do you think?
Yes, no, that's a fascinating question, Pierre. So I was looking at the province of Quebec recently, and Quebec used to be a major manufacturer of automobiles for the US market. But for a variety of reasons, most of those factories have closed in Quebec and moved to Ontario. So the current premier of Quebec, he has this idea of Quebec becoming like a one-stop shop for electric vehicles. He says, we have cobalt in Quebec, we have lithium in Quebec, we have a variety of other rare earths in Quebec, we have hydroelectric power in Quebec. So he's trying to present Quebec as an alternative to China. That's exactly what he's trying to do. So that's definitely worth exploring, is whether Canada could, in some ways, develop the ability to supply the U.S. with these rare earths and with the lithium for lithium ion batteries. That's definitely something worth exploring. But of course, that's it takes time, obviously. There's another development. I didn't talk about this, but you reminded me, Pierre. When we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions, we just assume if you have a factory that burns oil, you're going to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But that's actually not true. There actually is technology to take those carbon emissions and store them underground. And so now there are 2 pipelines that have been proposed that would take carbon dioxide emissions from ethanol plants in the Midwest and store the carbon in the rock formations in North Dakota and South Dakota. So carbon sequestration, carbon capture, carbon. For example, if you plant trees, what do trees do? Trees consume carbon, right? So there is another approach, which is to make the burning of fossil fuels, less damaging to the environment.
Seems like a better way to do it.
Okay.
Anytime.
All right, Nils, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was sort of missing in this whole picture was the effect of potential use of nuclear power. I know I'm in California at this point, and I know we have a water crisis and other things like that. Maybe not this year because of all our rain, but desalinization has been something that's been talked about for years here, and every now and then we get close to doing something, but it doesn't seem to have any foothold. So
Nuclear.
is nuclear power not an option for some of these things?
Yes,
And,
as I pointed out, yeah, that's a good question, Niels. As I pointed out early in the presentation, about 8% of the power generated in the United States comes from nuclear power plants. So it is, a significant source of energy. In some countries like France, France generates a very large percentage of its electricity from nuclear power. So nuclear power is definitely an option. The problem is politically, especially in democratic countries, it's a hard sell, because of the Fukushima meltdown in Japan, because of the accident, in Ukraine. And the 3 Mile Island in the United States. So because of these nuclear accidents, there's fear of nuclear power. So unless there's political will, I don't see that happening in the United States. I don't see a huge movement toward nuclear power.
Sad.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. I think that as other power shortages become more prevalent, I think that there's going to be more looking at the nuclear side of it, because I know technology has moved forward in how to produce the nuclear power, and it might be more acceptable, hopefully, in the future.
All right, thanks, Nils. Jack Gannon has a question.
Yes, I do. Dr. Holland, I wanted to ask, how is it that China was able to anticipate the need for cobalt, lithium, and other rare earth materials in renewable technology, while the U.S. came late to the game and seems to be playing catch up?
Yes, Jack, that's actually a story also with regard to semiconductors. The United States really let the production of semiconductors shift to Asia. And now the US produces very few, advanced semiconductors. They're basically, they use American technology, but they're produced in, primarily Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and China. So just economics, because China can manufacture anything, at a much lower cost than we can. That's led us to allow, these industries to develop in China, because they can do the mining, they can do the processing, they can do the exploring at a lower cost than we can. And also I can tell you, if I've worked in China extensively, there's no such thing as not in my backyard. So whenever the Chinese Communist Party decides that they're going to open a lithium mine, the farmers in that area have no voice whatsoever. So the cost factor really encourages China to take the lead in these kinds of industries. And also China attracts huge amounts of foreign investment. So investors from the US, from Europe, they've invested billions of dollars in China. I think it's the cost factor that really explains why they've taken such a huge lead with rare earths.
Okay, thank you. Larry Chimino, you got something you'd like to add here?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And I read recently that Sweden has discovered quite a large amount of rare earth, although apparently there's an enormous amount estimated to be there. It could take 10 to 15 years to bring it online, and apparently the concentration is quite low, so it'd probably be more expensive to extract that than what's coming out of China or what's coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo and so forth. Obviously, being in the European Union, they're going to have more environmental issues related to the extraction than you'd find in DRC or in China too. So whether it be cost competitive is going to be interesting to see. But just having noted that, I wanted to ask you about U.S. being a net exporter now of fossil fuels. Do we really produce all that we need in the forms that we need it, or do we really still rely on, well, if you added up imports versus exports in terms of pure quantity, don't we still need to import different types of oil to meet our oil demands here? And while we're exporting some, it turns out to be a net export in the equation, but we're not really energy self-sufficient completely here in hydrocarbons, are we?
No, that's a good question, Larry. So again, look at each individual refinery, and each refinery needs a particular type of input. And some refineries, they can process, crude oil, but other refineries can only process, lighter oil. So again, Saudi Arabia has probably the best quality of oil for most American refineries. So American crude oil needs more energy to be refined than, say, oil from Saudi Arabia. So you're right that it depends on the technology that's being utilized by that particular refinery, whether oil from Saudi Arabia or Iraq might be more cost effective for them than crude oil from Texas.
Okay, thank you. So I have a kind of another question about China and the relationship with Russia. We see as part of this Ukraine war situation that China appears to be supporting them. They're buying a lot of Russian oil. Is Russia, in a sense, deceiving itself into thinking they're going to be a long-term market as China expands its alternative energy mix, and that maybe China is just using this as a way to keep Russia supported to distract us from paying attention to all the things China is doing? So kind of understand what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, so China is definitely making progress in the development of renewable energy. They have the largest number of wind turbines, the largest number of solar cells. They're producing more wind power and sun power than any other country. That's true. But at the same time, their population is so large that they need a very, very large supply of fossil fuels as well. And also remember, the standard of living in China is far below that in the United States or Western Europe. And so Xi Jinping says he wants China to be a middle income country by, I think, 2035. So for China to be a middle-income country by then, the amount of energy that will be consumed will have to rise tremendously. So I see the demand for both renewable energy and fossil fuel energy to continue to rise in China over the next decades.
So they'll stay as a long-term customer of Russia then, huh?
For sure, India as well. Yeah, India. Think of that. Both India and China, the two world's most populous countries, 2.8 billion people between the two of them, both now becoming reliant on Russia for their oil and natural gas.
So this is kind of an unanticipated side effect of some of the the restrictions we're putting on Russia.
Yes, they're for every every action there's a reaction. So you can see that. So what was actually happening, if you look at the world, Ray, you can see these two blocks forming. This sort of China, Russia, India, Iran block, and then the U.S. European Union block. So in terms of world conflict, it's the world's becoming a more dangerous place.
Yeah, interesting. Betty, did you have a comment or question?
I do. Yeah, two quick questions. And one just on the last thing you said. Ken, on your map, Canada is also a very large oil producing country, right?
Oh, yes, definitely.
So I know there's a geopolitics in this. With some of the friendlier nations that you just mentioned, for example, India, despite its problems with nationalism, and they are still a democracy, and they're still a friend. Couldn't India also just get its oil from Canada as easy as it might from Russia? Number one, but the other one I wanted to ask was, is Russia supplying enough oil to its own country? It's a strong oil producer, but it's not used as much oil as it sells. Could its own country, for its own advancement, not use more of its own oil? Or if for Putin it's just a matter of this is money, forget my own country's needs.
Well, Russia is one of the few countries in the world whose economy is shrinking.
Yeah.
And its population is also shrinking. And Russian industry is shrinking. So it really needs to find customers for its oil and natural gas and coal.
I was just thinking it's a cold country too. It's very cold.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It might need to be warmer than they are. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not, their economy is not growing. And so they really need to find outside markets for their fossil fuels.
And what about India getting its oil from Canada instead of Russia?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Betty. If you look at Canada and you ask yourself, where is the oil? It's concentrated in one province, Alberta. It's called the tar sands. The problem is that Canada has never been able to sell much oil to Asia, even though the market there is huge, because the oil would have to be transported by pipeline from Alberta over the Rocky Mountains into British Columbia, and then piped into ships there in Vancouver. But the politics of Canada are such, and Pierre perhaps wants to comment on this, the politics of Canada are such is there's a vast opposition to pipelines over the Rocky Mountains, and there's not much political support in British Columbia for the Port of Vancouver or any port in British Columbia to be a major place where oil is loaded onto ships and exported, because that leads, of course, to the risk of oil spills. Pierre, do you want to comment about the politics?
Is Alberta closer to that than the St. Lawrence Seaway?
Yeah, Alberta borders on British Columbia.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just agree with I would agree with what Ken just said. And Alberta has its own very strong politics, constantly in tension with the federal government. And yeah, British Columbia has a very different attitude than Alberta does. Yeah, but I think what Ken said is right on the mark. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Betty. Eric, you got a question?
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. One of my concerns, and it was reflected a little bit beforehand in the talk on nuclear energy, is the fact that until we really solve this clean base power element, we're going to have problems. And I was just wondering, I'm very optimistic about this being solved, but I was wondering what things, I know there's these 4th generation nuclear designs being tested out now. Are there any particular areas that you have that you're optimistic about in terms of this base clean power business?
Well, Eric, there's hydrogen power. I don't know if you've looked much into that, but there's huge potential in generating energy, from hydrogen. So obviously that would be a very clean source. And of course, there's unlimited amounts of hydrogen in the world. So there's a lot of, I know U.S. Department of Energy has funded a number of research projects into the development of hydrogen energy. And then if nuclear energy could be made safe, then of course it has tremendous potential as well. But yeah, there is this interest in hydrogen.
Yeah, one of the follow-up on that hydrogen, I've read several articles about it. It's good because it's portable, like other kinds of fuels. It does have a high cost today, at least, a high cost of production. That's kind of the downside of hydrogen. But you're right; it is a readily abundant element in the environment. Got kind of maybe I don't know if this is just sort of maybe a speculative question, but we have those who are saying today that maybe we just need to adapt to climate change and not worry about pumping all this carbon dioxide because the cost of retooling our economies is going to be so high. What are some of the pros and cons maybe of thinking about adaptation versus just sort of going all in and trying to come up with alternative energy? You got two sides of this question here.
Yeah, no, whenever there's a discussion of climate change, there's almost always someone in the discussion who says, well, it's probably cheaper for us to adapt to these changes than it is to make the shift to renewable energy. One of the problems, of course, is that it's easier for developed rich countries to adapt than it is for poor developing countries. Just think about the recent earthquake in Turkey and Syria. In a developed country, those buildings would have been constructed in accordance, with very strict building codes. And an earthquake of that magnitude would have caused some damage, but nothing like the damage that we saw in Syria and Turkey. But those buildings were constructed in those countries, not because the state is not very strong. So what building codes they have are not enforced strictly. And then a lot of, shoddy workmanship and materials are used. So you can see then that, a country like the Maldives, it's a developing country and it's being swallowed up by the rising sea levels. What can the Maldives do realistically to adapt? So it's much easier for the United States to adapt, to huge snowstorms and tornadoes and hurricanes and droughts. It's much easier for us than it is for developing countries to adapt.
Okay. So yeah, that's really kind of an interesting question there. And also the other part of this that I think, and I don't know why we don't see more discussion of this in the media, but if we look at the cost of all of these storms that we've been having in the last couple of years, billions of dollars we're losing in infrastructure and this town that was just destroyed by the tornadoes. And of course, tornadoes are not new, but it seems like the intensity and frequency of storms is higher, and the forest fires and so forth. When we start adding up the cost of all those things, I don't know if adaptation can counterbalance that. That's kind of I don't know thoughts on that. Sorry. We got a question here from Jim. I don't know your last name, Jim. You out there? Jim, I see you there. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's just a question about fracking and the impact it has on environment. You may have touched on it a bit, but living in the Midwest and having family and friends in the Dakotas, it seems like there's potential really significant damage to the aquifers that drive much of our agricultural output in the Midwest. And the cartoon you showed of how fracking often takes place beneath these aquifers that we're dependent upon for wheat and corn growth in much of the Midwestern states. So I was wondering if you saw any long-term problems with that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Jim. I like to compare New York State with Pennsylvania. And it's been very interesting to watch the politics of fracking work out in the two states, because Pennsylvania has gone all in on fracking, and you often will hear about big sinkholes opening up. You'll hear about earthquakes happening in Pennsylvania. So there have been side effects of fracking, and they've not been obviously very desirable. And in New York, the politicians in Albany say, we have the same kind of oil and gas trapped underneath our soil as Pennsylvania has, but we want nothing to do with fracking. So what they've done, they've weighed the cost and benefits and decided the cost outweigh the benefits. In Pennsylvania, the neighboring state, they've made the same calculation, which said, well, these benefits outweigh the cost. So it's really interesting because as you saw, fracking is only feasible in certain states. And then it's fun to look at the internal politics of each one of those states and look at the debate that takes place over pros and cons.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Louis Meyer, you're next.
Thank you.
Okay.
First of all,
Louis,
this last comment is interesting. I'm in New Mexico, and it's not only the internal politics, but the poverty of a state that determines. New Mexico has moved heavily toward fracking and is this year experiencing huge increase in resources, but the impacts of it ultimately will be discovered. My question is different, and it may be ignorant, and I apologize for that, but I'm always struck that when we talk about resources in the world for energy, there's always conversation about Russia, about China, about the impact on Europe, about the United States, some mention of Africa, the US, but there are whole chunks of the world that are never mentioned. And I specifically am interested in Latin America, South America. Venezuela is spoken about with oil, but is it that wise assessment has been done worldwide about where all of these various resources are located, and whole regions of the world, Australia, South America, et cetera, do not have these resources? Or is it just that people overlook large sections of the globe?
No, that's an excellent question, Lois. There's a phenomenon called the resource curse. And Venezuela is a very good example. I'm glad you mentioned it. So here's a country, the two countries that have the largest oil reserves are Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has obviously benefited from the production and sale of petroleum, but Venezuela, is a failed state. And Venezuela is now one of the largest sources of refugees in the world. Many of the refugees who come to the Mexico-US border, seeking asylum in the United States are now from Venezuela. So we can look at countries like Venezuela and say, yes, look at the huge resources this country has. But unless there's a functioning state, then there's not those resources will not benefit the people who live there, unfortunately. So, and again, the resource curse is found in many countries in Africa. Again, Nigeria has huge oil reserves, again, but they're not, really benefiting the people of Nigeria. Democratic Republic of the Congo, we discussed how it has the largest deposits of cobalt, which are needed for electric vehicles. But again, the people in the DRC, their standard of living is not rising as a result of the extraction of cobalt. So one way of looking globally, as you suggest, Lois, is to say, okay, let's look at where the resources are all around the world, but let's look at whether the exploitation of those resources actually is benefiting, the people who live in those countries.
But in that case, the question I think that Betty raised about Russia, Russia is clearly seen as a resource of oil, but are those resources actually benefiting the Russian people? And that's a different question than I originally asked. You seem to be implying that the world knows where the resources are. It's the only question is, are they accessible because of political reasons?
Yeah, one way to approach this is to look at China. China has the Belt and Road Initiative where they build infrastructure projects, Latin America, Africa, Asia. But often what the Chinese are after are these resources you're talking about, Lois. They'll go into a country and they'll say, okay, we'll build a railway, from one place to the next place. But at the same time, they're really after the resources they know are there. So the Chinese are, I guess, in some ways are more imperial, than some of the European countries were in the 19th century, because they are very focused on developing countries, often with weak states, but they have the resources that Chinese industry needs.
Wow, thank you.
All right, thank you, Lois. I just wanted to point out here, we've had two questioners, one from California and one from New Mexico now. So this is the ICWA's reach is quite extensive here. I'm happy to hear that. So Betty, did you have another question there?
I did. Kel, I just want to say what you're talking about in that last part is absolutely fascinating. This is just an area that I've tried to wrap my head around, but I'm not a scientist, and I just have a hard time thinking in terms of the oil production. But when you start talking politics, that is so fascinating, because the developing and the imperial exploitation of it, form of colonialism, it's wretchedly cruel when you think about it, because it's just the old biblical, the poor shall ever be poor, because circumstances like that. The question I had is really probably speaks more to my minimal knowledge of this. You use the word trapped, with oil and gas, natural gas being trapped unless we can reach it. What would happen if we you mentioned states who just know that it's beneath their surface, but they're not going to bother to get it. The renewable energies, it would take time and commitment. Of course, we talk about the jobs that could come with wind and solar energy and so forth. what would happen if we don't take the oil and the gas out? I mean, is it, would it explode or something, explode the earth? What would happen if we just left it? You use the word trapped as though it has to get out. Does it have to get out?
No,
And
in
there's
fact,
there's a danger in getting it out because of the methane gas releases and so forth and the damage. But what if we just left it there?
no, there are a group of environmental activists, and their main slogan is "Leave it in the ground." That's exactly what they say. Why do we need to extract, these deposits of, oil and gas? Those are the remnants of ancient plants. The plants have decayed over time, and what's left is the carbon that was in the plants originally. So these are, prehistoric plants that have decayed and become, oil and gas. But there's no logical. The only reason to extract them is economic, because
It's for our human need.
Yeah, John D. I went to the University of Chicago. The founder of the University of Chicago was John D. Rockefeller.
Right. Yeah.
John D. Rockefeller was really the first American entrepreneur to see there was a market for oil, and he founded the Standard Oil Company. So he knew that there was in fact, one of the first markets for oil that was extracted by the Standard Oil Company in Pennsylvania was China. China is he exported oil to China, back in the 19th century.
I was going to say, well, that would have been the late 19th century. But it could stay in the ground. It's not like it's going to blow up anytime soon. Okay. So, but it's just, well.
Like gold. Gold could stay in the ground, but if you extract gold, you're going to become quite wealthy, aren't you?
And then that just leads us to a whole philosophical, which we could spend, many evenings on. Why not renewable energy?
Well, in fact, my wife and I visited St. Louis last week, and we went to the Gateway Arch, and I thought back in American history when so St. Louis is the gateway to the West, but at one point Americans living along the East Coast, they described the land west of the Mississippi as wasteland. And what they meant by wasteland, it was of no value unless it was farmed or mined. See, unless it's exploited by human industry, that land is waste, is worthless.
Well, it wasn't to the indigenous, but that goes into a whole nother.
Yeah.
Or, with some 10,000 years when they made their migration down, right? Highly evolved societies, many of them. Yeah.
So that actually brings up a question that I had, was that we used to, 30, 40 years ago, used to hear fears of running out of oil, that the amount of oil that we were drilling was actually going to be depleted. And we never hear any discussion of that anymore. So I don't know whether that's a function of new drilling technologies, such as fracking and so forth, or whether that's a belief that we will develop alternative energy sources faster than we deplete the oil, and it will become a moot issue. So maybe that's just a comment. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Well, part of it is geology, Ray. Geologists keep discovering new deposits of oil.
Yeah,
a lot of it is undersea. So it's like, to just look at the East China Sea. It's a huge body of water, but underneath that huge body of water is again colossal amounts of oil and natural gas under the sea.
Well, it's getting to the witching hour here, Ken.
But I want to also, when we were talking about like electricity, because there was a wonderful discussion in when Indianapolis was going through the angst of the road expansion through Indianapolis and the whole displacement, which has gone across the United States with cities, that when you create these superhighways, it's usually poor neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, and the displacement happens there. And there was discussion, should we do the expansion of the major interstate system through a major city? And all of a sudden, a couple of young people held their hands up and said, why are you talking about creating a road system using a technology when you say these roads will last for decades out, when we, being much younger than you, are probably not going to use the technology that you're living on now. In other words, gas-fueled cars. Or even that they demand for more public transportation as opposed to everybody having a car to get around. And it just said, well, I guess I feel a little frustrated when I hear these kinds of discussions that we had tonight, because I see hope on one hand, but on the other hand, when you talk about exploitation of Ken, as you have, which is huge and massive world powers, it just feels like, can this really be won? Can you get a little philosophical for that, just to kind of close this up maybe, or?
Every country from an economic point of view looks at its comparative advantage. What is it that it can produce, at the lowest cost, with the highest quality compared to other countries? And so if you're an economist, you look, at current demand, but also you can also look at, future demand and future technologies. So yeah, it's good to dream about a pollution-free world. But if you are, like me, you're a political scientist, you look at international relations as they are today, and obviously the trade in fossil fuels is one of the major sources of conflict in the world, and it's also one of the most important commodities that's traded around the globe. So I think, Betty, everything really depends on your time frame, and if you're looking at the current situation in the world, fossil fuels play an enormous role.
Yeah, they do. And they also help bring the electricity that brings the electric cars, because the electricity has to be produced somehow. That includes also fossil fuels and the oil. And yeah, but we also, going back to the initial discussion, when we've had the panels of young people with climate change, they'll bring up the issues that climate change will be a major cause for war because of lack of water. And also a migration. And we see what the migration does to a place like Europe, and even here in the United States, how angry people get because they feel like their life of cultural roots is being disrupted by these migrating people. Yeah. I'd like to be more of an optimist about it, but I just feel a little pessimistic. But I thought maybe you could end us on a positive philosophical note.
Well, I think the positive note is that we're not dependent on Russia for oil.
Okay,
So we're in a much better position than Germany is.
well, and then Indiana is number one of those are turbine farms.
There you go.
I get a kick out of looking at them. I know some people don't. I know Ray and I didn't. When we had to trek up to Michigan City to see Robin with our. Didn't you say also, Ray, that you like the turbine farms? Was that you?
Yep, yep.
Yeah, I get a kick out of them. They're kind of neat. All right. Well, that's been a really interesting discussion. And, and unfortunately, it's almost a circular discussion because so many of the things we talk about, nothing really has an end to it, which is why we keep meeting each time and why we keep talking about some of the same countries every year. But this is sort of a discussion that has no end. And my heart likes to put more hope into maybe the young people who are going to live with this so much longer than those of us who are sort of on the other, whose runways are just a bit shorter than the runways of very young people. And they want to have hope. They need to have hope. I just thought it was an interesting point that the young people were saying when they were talking about building this massive highway to do this massive upset once again of neighborhoods for that was going to take them decades out. And they were saying, why do you think we want decades of the same thing? We wanted something different for our future. So it's going to be interesting, folks, to see what people are talking about 50 years from now on this and what they're going to say about us now when we might have had a chance to do things a little differently. So maybe great decisions will still be around 50 years from now. What do you think, Janet? Do you think it will be? I know you're a great follower of this.
All right, well, Ken, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. This was great. We really appreciate it, and enjoy your
Yeah.
trip to Iceland.
Yes,
Yes.
looking forward to it.
Yeah, for those of you who didn't hear, Ken's leaving tomorrow to head to Iceland for a week, so.
Is it for business or are you just having some fun?
It's for my birthday.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, happy birthday. We won't sing happy birthday to you, Kevin.
All right.
So
Well,
you'll be
thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next program.